Residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment in northern London began complaining about their drains being clogged. Initially, their landlord was like, it's an old building, the plumbing, it's old, that's why it's slow. But eventually the landlord conceded and asked for a plumber to come out and have a look. So on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Rock came out to Cranley Gardens. He went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain. As expected, when he shined his light down, it was disgusting. He saw wads of hair, napkins, and other things all mashed together, clogging up the pipes. So he reached in and he began pulling all of this stuff out of the pipes. It was disgusting, and he put it in this bucket. And then after he cleared the floating obstructions, he reached his arm all the way into the pipe. His arm completely disappeared in the pipe. Rock waved his hand back and forth to snag other objects. Almost immediately, his hand hits this blockage. And so he moved his fingers to determine what it was. But this was a texture he never experienced before. It was fairly soft, but there were also like these hard things in it, like sticks, projecting into the soggy, wet, bready stuff. The blockage he pulled out. He opened his hand, and the stuff in his hand looked like ground meat. He was horrified, and inside this fleshy substance, there appeared to be white bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, but he never saw anything like this. The sun was going down, so Mike Rock put the cap back on the drain, walked from behind the building back towards his truck, and as he's walking, two of the residents of the complex came out and said, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? And what was it?" And Mike would be like, "No, I have to come back in the morning. Seems like there's meat or something in the pipes." Then a neighbor blurts out, "Yeah, I bet it's just some of that Popeye's fried chicken down in the drains." Rock just looked at him like, "You're a moron," turned, went back to his truck, and drove away. The next morning, Rock and his supervisor came back to the Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building and pulled the cap off again. Mike reached down inside, expecting to feel the blockage, but now there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes, and so Mike looked at his supervisor and said, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Something had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why anybody would do that unless there was foul play." But then Rock was like, you know what? Who cares? And maybe it wasn't meat after all. But his supervisor said, "Let's check the other apartments' pipes and figure out if there's any obstruction over there." They did. They found nothing except for apartment number 23. Apartment 23's pipes were a freaker. Tons of meaty substances inside those pipes. Rock and his manager were very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out there in the middle of the night and cleared the pipes. Now that they were finding this weird meat substance coming from apartment 23, and so they alerted the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out too and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where the pathologist looked at it and said, "This is human meat." In particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelmingly stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment. This guy is in his late 30s, early 40s, and introduces himself as Dennis Nilson. And they say, "Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it. They say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the bodies are." And at this point, Dennis suddenly went from expressionless, emotionless, and then he just turned around and said, "They're in the bedroom. 2 plastic bags in the closet." And so before the police could go into the apartment to inspect the bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in the apartment?" Dennis sighs. He looks up to the ceiling and says, "Yep, there are about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell you about it. I actually need to get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station." So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the police station, he told them this horrible story. It all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having a few pints by himself, and a teenager came in and tried to buy an alcoholic beverage but was denied. Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Stephen, was very excited and said, "Hey, great, let's go." Once they arrived back at Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots to drink, and they were having fun and laughing. And then at some point, the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning when Dennis got up, his friend Stephen was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. He knew Stephen would wake up, leave him, not want to be his friend, and he couldn't stand it. He wanted Stephen to stay, and so he looked on the ground next to the bed, and he saw the necktie that Stephen had been wearing the night before. Dennis grabbed a necktie, he made a slip knot, and then he climbed back into bed, got on top of Stephen's chest, he looped the tie around his neck, and then pulled it tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell the police that Stephen became alive. And he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but the knot was tight and secure. And at that point, Dennis said, Stephen just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this thing off his neck. And Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Stephen just allowed himself to go limp. And then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said, he relaxed. But he's looking at Stephen. He realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen. He gets this huge plastic bucket. He fills it up with water. He sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Stephen's body into the kitchen. He lays him on his back on the chairs, but makes sure his head is not rested on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of the chairs, and he grabs the bucket of water and then slid it right underneath Stephen's head, and then Dennis got on top of the chair, on top of Stephen, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down into the water, backwards until his mouth and nose were under the water. Dennis held him under until Stephen regained consciousness. But again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed, and after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface. Stephen was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off the chair. He brought him in to the living room, and he sat him on the chair, and then Dennis went into the kitchen, made himself a cup of coffee, smoked a cigarette, and just stood in the doorway and looked at his best friend Stephen's body. And he would tell the police it was bizarre. Stephen still looked like he was alive. and it felt like he finally had a friend. Hey, if you like this story, hit like now, subscribe, hit notifications, and don't forget to comment. Now let's get back to the story. In fact, Dennis would try to talk to him as if he was gonna talk back, but obviously he didn't. At some point, Dennis realized the life he had before he killed Stephen was now over. He had a new life as a murderer, and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought was he needed to clean Stephen. So he took Stephen's body, brought him into the bathroom, and he gave him a long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair, dressed him, and put him back in bed. And then Dennis climbed in bed with him. He would tell the police the two of them would lay together, and he felt joy. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so that no one could find him. Dennis went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. He brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Stephen up, he just couldn't do it. So instead, he just climbed into bed with Stephen and took a nap. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the floor, onto the ground in his living room, and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner, and then sat in his chair in the living room next to Stephen. They watched TV together. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized he hadn't made much progress in hiding Stephen's body. That's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up and saw there was about enough space to put the body in there. He grabbed Stephen's body, attempted to force it into this crawl space, but by now Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up with rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched, I don't even know what, like a crazy mummy. So Dennis just tried to force him in there, but his arms were not allowing him to. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he just propped him up against the wall in the bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up, rigid, with the arms out like a crazy mummy. Stephen's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got into bed and fell asleep like a baby with his best friend overlooking him. Dennis woke up the next morning and knew he had to hide Stephen's body. Dennis started working on his legs and hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down into that floorboard. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went out about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But a week after putting him into the floor, Dennis decided he missed his best friend. He wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen. And Dennis would say he looked dirty. So he pulled him out of the floorboards and gave him a bath. And then after he had cleaned Stephen, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, put him in a chair, and then Dennis took a bath himself in the same bath water that Stephen was cleaned in. After a long soak in the tub, Dennis finally got out. He toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced Stephen back into the floorboards. Dennis finally decided to dispose of Stephen by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing more than 15 young men, in northern London, all by strangulation, drowning, or a combination of the two. He would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, cabinets, beds, underneath floorboards, all over his apartment. He had these bodies everywhere. He liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them, his best friends, like huge Ken dolls, besties. He would tell police he found corpses beautiful. He was fascinated by them, and eventually in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. So he began cutting them up and trying to force them into the drains, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered his meaty substances in the pipes, Dennis overheard him talking about it. Dennis attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes, but he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipes that led to his apartment. Dennis Nilson confessed to killing 15 young men, attempting to kill 7 others. Dennis is a nut job sentenced to life in prison. Dennis showed no remorse. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. And in 2018, Dennis Nilson would die in prison at the age of 72. So was that creepy or what, guys? That story freaks me out so much. I don't look at floorboards in old homes the same anymore. And I'm kind of sweating just thinking about it. I'm AG and I'm out.